Okay, texture is, remember, a formal element of design, and it has to do with surface quality or surface characteristics. Texture is going to give us a sense of surface, and any object will have texture. It will be smooth, it will be rough, it will be hard, it will be soft. So anything that you hold in your hand, anything that you stand on, sit on, lie down on, bump up against, is going to have a surface, and therefore there's a quality to that surface. So a lot of times people who are somewhat naive will think that things are textured only if they're rough, or only if there's a lot of highs and lows in the surface. And that's not true. Anything that has a surface has a texture, whether it's smooth or rough. So we look at this textile design. It's mostly yellow, obviously, but then there's some white linear elements moving through, and how they relate to each other and compile on each other and compound create a sense of surface. As we're looking at this, it's very subtle, but there feels like there's some bumps or some nubbles in the surface. Notice also that we recognize that because there's parts of the design that appear to be lighter and parts of the design that appear to be darker. So our visual recognition of texture is a value pattern issue, a light dark understanding. Physical texture is something you actually touch. Texture relates to the tactile sense of touch. And so physical texture actually feels like it will look. We will feel the roughness, we will feel the softness of something. So physical texture is real or actual texture rather than being virtual texture. Visual texture will be what we perceive on something that has physical texture, but we can also create a visual texture through pattern making. And the pattern that we create on a surface may not have the same texture as the surface physically. So visual texture can even contradict the physical texture. Things like faux finishes and wood grain in laminate flooring and a formica countertop or linoleum that looks like it's travertine or something like that. That would be a visual texture that's different than the actual physical. Physical texture is something that takes on different appearances depending upon how far you are away from it, and also the angle of the light and how much light you've got going on. So with physical texture, the visual appearance will be different from morning to night and up close versus far away. That's a very important thing to understand. The visual understanding will change when you have physical texture. When you have visual texture, when you just have the, especially from pattern making, it doesn't change given light. It'll change a little bit with distance, which we observed in Project 3 with the optical fusion. But generally, the angle of the light, the time of day, is not going to change it that much. This is a stucco wall, the same wall at two different times of day, and they look like two totally different surfaces. But here on the left, the angle of the light is actually coming from the side and giving darker shadows and so forth. So we have where the light's hitting, and then where it's not hitting, creating that sense of roughness. And then where the lighting is much more flat, we're seeing the same texture in a very different way. When we have bas-relief or low-relief carvings such as this one, the overall visual impression will change depending upon the lighting situation. With visual texture, since it is man-made for the most part, there are certain things that, or certain varieties of textures that we'll deal with. Again, talking about texture that's purely visual separates it from those that are physical, which also have the visual understanding with them. So when we're talking about visual texture, right now we are talking about those things that result from pattern making or from drawing or from the process of whatever it is we're doing. Invented texture is the result of a process. The drawing here has a roughness and a busyness in the top half that's very smooth in the bottom, so there's a textural contrast going on, but we get a sense of energy and clutter and crowdedness on the street as we are looking at the outlines of the buildings and how they kind of run over each other, and everything crowds and becomes very dense versus things that are more sparse and scattered. So when you draw and you start building up line and you start building up tone, you are inventing texture. The current popularity of distress and grunge and the dirty look in a lot of design, especially graphic design, is also invented. The idea of antiquing or creating a weathered sort of look on something is invented. Even the process of sanding or scraping something to thereby change the texture is invented. Abstract texture is drawn from something that is real. So we have the pillow on the left, which is stylized wood grain, kind of interesting for a pillow. And then the pillow on the right is stylized animal hide, animal print. So these both represent the idea of abstract texture. Now, real wood will not only have the visual appearance, but until it's really sanded down and polished and even varnished, it's going to have a roughness to it. And the animal hide will have that furriness to it in reality. This has, you look at this and you kind of expect this to be hard, simply because it looks like it's made out of wood. And so there is a visual pun kind of going on there with the pillow on the left. Representational texture is basically rendered texture that is recalling directly actual physical texture. So in this Dürer painting, this self-portrait, the texture of the hair is very different than the furry collar and the sense of the robe that he's wearing. Then there's the texture of the skin and so forth. So this is a variety of representational textures that help us understand what this person looked like. And the same thing with this David painting, another self-portrait. We have the texture of the hair. There's a subtle texture in the background on the wall. There's the texture of the jacket, the texture that's created by the folds in the cravat and the shirt, and the texture of the seat and the wood here. So representational texture is drawn directly from things that actually are, and it's trying to recreate what it actually is. A good understanding of texture like this helps us bring things into reality. We can take fantasy and make it appear real by virtue of texture. This is a pointillist era painting, and it's obviously depicting female nude seen from the back, and we can see kind of an environment that she's sitting in and a surface that she's sitting on. But the application of the paint is creating a visual roughness to the piece. And so we are getting a sense of three-dimensionality, plastic space going on in here, the illusion of volume, at the same time that the treatment of the surface in terms of the textural effect created by how the paint was applied is giving us a strong two-dimensional understanding. And we've seen this part of the diptych here on the right before. This is the whole story. We have the lady on the left looking at the two lovers and probably not real happy about it. But notice the various patterns creating visual textures and what that does in terms of telling the story. The sharpness of the triangles here basically give her a sense of anger, irritation, and then the roundness here is actually helping tell the story of the embrace. So just the choice of texture, just the choice of shapes that make up that pattern help to tell the story of what's going on here. This is from the pre-Raphaelite period, and we have the lady in the boat on the water, and we have a background behind her that is a little more mottled and fused together in terms of it's a little quieter, not as detailed. Remember atmospheric perspective when we're dealing with spatial devices. Things in atmospheric perspective, things that are closer will be more detailed, more textured in terms of the detailing of the texture, more colorful, things like that. Things further away will be less because there's particles in the atmosphere that start to obscure our vision and that gets kind of foggy. This happens even on a clear day, and so the sense of distance is really one of getting the textural contrast going really well. So we've got the reeds in the water and the lily pads and so forth, and we've got all of her drapings and everything, her hair and everything, and the boat, and all of those different realistic textures are fairly well detailed, but then we get back here into the long distance and we don't have the same detailing. So we have a strong sense of depth in this painting. Same thing kind of is happening here in the Maxfield Parish. The figures, of course, are foreground, and they almost seem like sculptures. The textures and the folding of the robe on the gown on the reclining figure. Not much texture in the two columns, but then we get to the trees, the branches and their blossoms and all the leaves and everything coming down, and they're fairly detailed. And then we move back into space and just kind of fade out into, you know, the ethereal whatever, the back of beyond back there. And very little textural idea, very little roughness and detailing back in here. But where our eye goes is toward the trees. The figures seem to fuse a little bit together, and we're looking at all this foliage. And so we have a nice contrast between the foliage and its great detail and the smoothness of the, we'll call it the canyon atmosphere back here. So, to review. So we look at this. Can you recognize the balance? What kind of structure it is? The kind of space it's depicting? The rhythmic understanding of it? Texture. Texture should be really obvious in this. The overall shape, shape relationships, types of shapes, linear elements, dominant compositional stress, any focal point. In terms of balance, there is a dominant axis here. This panel is darker than these two, and it also has some of the darkest and lightest, that value contrast going on. And So this actually helps balance out the almost but not quite square over here. Notice also it's almost using the rule of thirds. In fact, it pretty much is. We have the horizontal space divided in thirds, and we have the vertical space divided into thirds. It is definitely flat two-dimensional spatial understanding. There is no spatial device that's helping create the illusion of volume whatsoever. There's a variety of rhythms going on. We have alternating or metric, and we have the same thing up here. And in certain repetitive elements we also have alternating and metric. There is a sense of movement of color here and there, so that there's a little bit of progressive rhythm going on. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. It's definitely textured in terms of really kind of mushy and thick and rich and kind of slobbed together and kind of in the middle. And then different textural effect down here, lots more smoothness up in the upper areas. Line, lots of implied line. Some linear elements because of the drips and everything. So what's the stress? The compositional stress of this is cruciform. Because it is equally divided, we have two divisions across, well, going from top to bottom, so two vertical divisions and two horizontal divisions, so it basically evens out, and it would be considered cruciform. And where do you think the focal point is? We have this kind of darker area in here, but then we have this little guy up here. This is actually part of the painting up here. So it is an assemblage, a bringing together of stuff into one piece. So there's a painting and then stuff stuck on. Definitely modernist and postmodern. Definitely looking at texture and color and spatial understanding as those two ideas relate to each other. This seems to be the thing that is least like anything else. It relates to other things because of the color, and it is part of the painting, but there is your focal point right there. And then this is kind of a secondary emphasis, and then you have other areas that are also kind of secondary and tertiary emphases. Something completely different. We have a asymmetric balance, definitely rectangular structure, starts formal and actually remains formal throughout pretty much in terms of how that space is divided. The space is definitely two-dimensional. The rhythm, kind of like Mondrian gone wanky a little bit, but there's a lot of rhythm going on in terms of repetitive elements. There is a lot of smoothness and simplicity versus a lot of energy and roughness and just activity going on over in here. There is the repetitive rhythm and texture going on in here. This feels like kind of a crenellated edge, like the edge of a pie or something like that. Implied line, definitely all over the place. Resorting mostly to geometric shapes. In fact, I think pretty much everything is geometric in there. Stress is diagonal. Compositional stress is diagonal, and where's the focal point? The focal point is the title of the magazine, Domus. And one more. So what do you see here? balance is approximately symmetrical. There are variations on either side. There is a very obvious center axis coming straight down here, equal distance side to side to the edges of the picture plane. We have this movement of the sash coming in here, wrapping and going up over the shoulder. This is wheat, this is a sword, and we have different depictions of the hand and so forth. We have this element here. So it's approximately symmetrical. It is volumetric space in terms of how things are rendered out, but there's also a flatness. It's a closed composition, and we have the name piece, this rectangular shape with the letter forms in it, sitting in front. So we have a sense of looking through something, through this frame into something else, but definitely becomes a more decorative rather than realistic image because of the way the piece is actually framed. It's a closed composition. Rhythm, there's a lot of flow, there's a lot of alternating rhythm going on, a little bit of progressive as we move up and get a little wider on these little banner things that are furling. Line, there's definitely implied line, there's psychological line, there's actual line, there's inscribed line. Compositional stress, it's vertical. And what's the focal point? There are two different focal points going on in here. One is psychological, and the other is more in terms of positional. The psychological, of course, is here, and the circle around the head helps frame her. The one that's more positional is here. This becomes an anchor point, and it's also sitting in front spatially, and so the ad for this, which is why this illustration was made, this is a ad for clothiers, so this needs to be a focal point. And notice that we have one focal point here and one focal point here, and they're a vertical relationship to each other.